There's a divine rhythm to relationships, and sometimes that rhythm includes silence, the silence of no contact. And in that silence, we often find ourselves questioning, wondering, replaying memories that once felt like promises. But let me tell you something today, beloved. When a man walks away and then tries to return, it's not always about you. It's about what God allowed to be revealed in the silence. There's something powerful about the distance, something holy. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Why they come back. Why they reach for you after they've let you go. This isn't just about romance. It's about clarity, about worth, about identity. Because when you know who you are in God, no one's absence has the power to confuse your value. So, let's talk about it. When you choose to step away, to go no contact, not out of spite, but from a place of self-respect and emotional clarity, your absence begins to speak louder than any words ever could. A man who once had constant access to your love, your warmth, your loyalty, and your emotional energy, now finds himself in a space that echoes. And that echo becomes a mirror. In that stillness, he starts to see not just who you were in his life, but who he was when he was with you, and who he is now without you. This is not about revenge or punishment. This is about divine revelation. You see, sometimes your presence was covering up a void he never dared to face. You were the calm to his storm, the encouragement to his doubt, the voice of wisdom in his confusion. And when all of that is suddenly gone, it forces him to confront the silence he's left with. In that silence, he doesn't just miss you, he starts to recognize what he never truly appreciated. Your absence has a power. It dismantles illusions. It strips away convenience. Because when you were there, he didn't have to try too hard. He didn't have to look inward. You were doing the emotional labor. You were the one showing up, being consistent, being nurturing, being present. And now that you step back, all the illusions that made him believe he was whole without doing the inner work begin to fall apart. And what's so profound, beloved, is that sometimes your absence is what gives a man the permission to finally face himself. When you were there, he could distract himself with you. He could avoid accountability, lean on your strength, borrow your peace. But now he has to create those things on his own. And often he realizes how far he is from doing so. The mirror doesn't lie. It doesn't flatter. It simply reveals. And in this revealing, he sees the truth that your presence was never ordinary, that your consistency was never guaranteed, that your love had depth, and that it wasn't something he could replicate with just anyone. He might try, he might reach out to others, but what God anointed in you cannot be counted. This is why men return. Because in your absence, they are forced to remember, to reflect, to reevaluate. They remember the safety they felt in your presence, not because you coddled them, but because your spirit was anchored. They reflect on the way you handled conflict with grace, the way you covered them in prayer, the way you reminded them of purpose even when they were drifting. They reevaluate the story they told themselves about you, that maybe you were too much or too intense or too deep. And now in hindsight, they see it was simply that you were whole and they weren't ready. Your absence becomes his mirror, not to torment him, but to teach him. And while he is watching himself in the mirror, you are healing, you are rising, you are rediscovering your voice, your boundaries, your divine assignment. So when he does return, it's not about whether you take him back. It's about whether he has evolved enough to deserve access to the woman who chose herself. Because when you removed yourself from the space where you are being undervalued, you didn't just walk away You ascended. The silence disrupts his illusion and communication breaks. And all the messages stop flowing. No calls, no texts, no late night check-ins. Something shifts. And often that shift is not immediate. It creeps in slowly. At first he thinks he's fine. He thinks his life will continue uninterrupted. Maybe he even convinces himself that this distance was needed, that it was his decision. But silence, true silence, has a way of cracking the illusions people build around their ego. You see, when a man walks away or detaches, he's usually doing it under a specific belief system. The belief that he can leave and return at will. The belief that you'll always be there. The belief that he still holds emotional power over you, even in his absence. But the longer that silence lasts, the more his perception begins to crumble. Because silence isn't just an empty space, it's a mirror, a teacher, a loud reminder that nothing is as secure as pride makes it seem. At first, he assumes the silence is mutual. He assumes you're waiting. He assumes that your lack of contact means you're trying to appear strong but still emotionally tied to him. That illusion allows him to keep living in comfort. But then days pass. And those days become weeks. And those weeks begin to sound different, feel different. Your silence doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like detachment. It feels like peace. It feels like movement. And now his illusion begins to unravel. He starts to wonder, why hasn't she reached out? Is she really okay without me? Did I really matter to her the way I thought I did? Or did she just decide she deserves more? And in those questions, he meets something unfamiliar. The truth. He realizes the control he thought he had was never real. The dynamic he assumed he managed was in reality held together by your grace, by your patience, by your willingness to carry the weight of connection even when he failed to match your depth. And now that you're no longer participating in the illusion, the whole thing falls apart. The silence becomes disruptive, not because it is loud, but because it is honest. It shows him the life he thought he had, the relationship he assumed he managed, and the influence he believed he held. None of it was grounded in reality. It was grounded in your effort. And now that your effort has been withdrawn, what remains is emptiness. Not just the absence of your words, but the absence of your energy, your encouragement, your covering, your prayers, the way you used to sense his emotional climate without him ever needing to explain it, the way you forgave him before he even said, "I'm sorry," the way you created safe space for him to be unsure, to be confused, to be imperfect, without shaming him. That's what he starts to miss. He doesn't just miss you, he misses the version of himself that felt most secure around you. The version of himself he thought he could access at any time. But now, in the silence, he realizes that version only showed up because you made it possible. And that's when fear sets in. That's when pride begins to crack. That's when the illusion turns into longing. Here's the beauty, beloved. The silence is not your revenge. It is your redemption. Because in choosing silence, you chose self-preservation. You chose healing. You chose dignity. You chose not to beg for clarity where confusion was being used to control you. And in doing so, you disrupted a false narrative he had about who you was in your life and who you were in his. The silence became a sword that cut through the fog. And now he sees. But sometimes by the time the fog clears, the woman he once knew has already outgrown the space he left her in. He realizes Your emotional presence was never ordinary. At first, he didn't notice. He received it so consistently, so freely, that it felt normal, almost expected. But that's the thing about a gift that flows from a pure heart. It doesn't demand recognition. It just gives. You gave with your presence. Not just physical, but emotional. You were available, you were attentive, you were spiritually present, even in the mundane moments. You listened without rushing. You affirmed without manipulation. You gave him room to exhale. And now, without you there, he begins to feel the absence, not just of a person, but of a covering. Something he didn't know he was being protected by until it was gone. Your presence wasn't ordinary because it wasn't transactional. You weren't calculating how much to give based on how much he gave back. You weren't trying to manipulate his attention with silence or performance. You showed up fully, emotionally available. Vulnerable in ways that required strength most men don't even recognize until they've lost it. He begins to realize that what he called too emotional or too intense was actually just deep emotional intelligence. You understood his moods. You sensed his fears before he could articulate them. You created a space where he didn't have to pretend. You didn't shame his struggle or try to fix him. You just held it. You carried his storms in prayer. You poured your intuition over his confusion and called it peace. And because you made it look easy, he assumed it was. But emotional presence is spiritual work. And not everyone can do it. And when you withdrew, he encountered something foreign. Conversations that felt shallow, interactions that lacked depth. He began to notice that not everyone sees him like you did. Not everyone hears the things he doesn't say. Not everyone can sit with his silence without feeling uncomfortable. You didn't just respond to his words, you responded to his soul. And that kind of connection, that kind of awareness, that is sacred. But here's the thing. When a man doesn't know how to receive something sacred, he treats it casually. He thinks it will always be there. He thinks it's replaceable. He believes the energy you gave was just part of being in a relationship until he finds himself in the company of someone who can't hold what you held, can't carry what you carried, can't reflect what you mirrored. He begins to miss the moments he once overlooked, the way you checked in on him when he was quiet, not just when he was loud. The way you noticed when his spirit felt heavy, even when his words were cheerful. The way you celebrated him, not for what he did, but for who he was becoming. Your emotional presence didn't just respond to his life, it elevated it. And now that it's no longer there, he realizes he never should have assumed it was easy to find. And maybe, just maybe, he begins to see that what he called drama was actually discernment. What he dismissed as doing too much was actually you making room for him to exist fully. What he resisted as pressure was actually an invitation to grow. But it takes time for a man to realize that it takes space. It takes silence. It takes him being confronted with emotional absence to realize what emotional fullness felt like. And you, while he's processing all this, you are growing. Because the woman who gave emotionally without return is now learning to give that same presence to herself. You're no longer pouring where you're not being poured into. You're no longer shrinking to make someone feel secure. You're no longer mistaking emotional labor for love. And that shift, that is what makes your emotional presence not only powerful, but the bond wasn't fake. He just wasn't ready. It's easy for someone to walk away and convince themselves that what they had wasn't real. It makes it easier to cope, easier to detach, to minimize, to rewrite the story in a way that makes them feel in control of their decision. It wasn't that serious. We weren't that connected. It wouldn't have worked anyway. But deep down, where the noise of ego can't reach, there's a knowing. A bond was there, real, spiritual. And while you may have been ready to honor it, he was still fighting himself. He wasn't ready, not for the intimacy, not for the truth, not for the vulnerability it demanded, because a real bond doesn't let you hide, it exposes. It calls you higher, it brings to the surface everything you've ignored. And that's what your presence did for him. It called out the parts of him that were still fractured. It reflected back to him the man he could be if he let go of his fear. But sometimes when a person sees their reflection in love, they pay. Not because the reflection is ugly, but because it's honest. And if they've been living in a lie, honesty feels like danger. He wasn't faking the connection. He wasn't pretending to feel safe with you, but what he did pretend was that he could handle it, that he was ready to sustain it, that he was prepared to be seen and loved and known at a soul level. And when the pressure of being truly known began to press on his wounds, he ran, not from you, but from himself. You weren't asking too much. You were asking for presence. You were asking for consistency. You were asking for depth. You were asking for maturity. And he, still clinging to fragments of boyhood, saw all of that and realized he would need to grow in order to keep it. And growth is scary when your identity is wrapped in survival. When you've only ever been loved for your performance, someone who wants to love your truth can feel like a threat. So he left. He detached. Maybe abruptly, maybe quietly, maybe he gave you vague reasons, maybe he ghosted you altogether. But no matter how it happened, the story in his head had to be rewritten. Because facing the reality that he left something sacred because he wasn't ready is too heavy for a prideful heart. So he told himself it was never real, or not that deep, or that you were the problem. And for a while, that story worked, until life humbled him. Until he found himself in spaces that didn't challenge him, didn't see him, didn't invite him to be more. Until he encountered connections that didn't stretch his soul. Until he realized he felt safest with you, not because you coddled him, but because you saw his mess and still offered grace. Because you saw his confusion and still spoke purpose. Because you saw beyond what he gave and loved the parts he tried to hide. The bond wasn't fake, it was sacred. But sacred things require stewardship. And that's what he lacked. Not affection, not desire, stewardship. The maturity to protect what is holy. The humility to admit when you're not ready, but still honor the person who is. And now that you're gone and he's forced to sit with what he lost, the truth breaks through. He didn't walk away from emptiness. He walked away from something most people pray to find. And while he's coming to that realization, you are not the same woman he left. You are stronger, wiser, clearer. You no longer confuse potential with promise. You no longer try to prove your worth to someone who couldn't carry your depth. You know now the bond was real, but readiness is what determines whether it thrives or dies. He assumed you'd wait. There's something dangerous about assumption, especially when it's built on past patterns and not present truth. When he left, detach or distance himself, whatever way he chose to